Welcome to the Sales Prospectors Show, supported by Lease a Sales Rep, an Inc. 5000 company helping our clients grow sales by securing guaranteed appointments, qualified leads, and guaranteed contracts for their services and products across the U.S. I'm your host, Gil Pagan. You can also find us at leaseasalesrep.com. That's leaseasalesrep.com. And we're on all major social media channels, Instagram, LinkedIn, and the Facebook. Today, doing something a little bit different. I'm interviewing a gentleman by the name of David Sokosh. He is the CEO and founder of Brooklyn Watches. And if some of you know me and kind of know a little bit about my background, I'm a watch collector, an avid watch collector, mostly in the vintage area. I do own a couple of contemporary pieces, and I'm actually hunting for watches on any given weekend. I'm at a flea market, I'm online, I'm in auctions, I'll fly out to a state and attend a live auction of high-end watches because that's just what I like. And I wanted to interview David because he's obviously, we have an operation in New York, and I'm originally from there. And I found out about David's Brooklyn Watches business because I came across an article in the Wall Street Journal that kind of laid out his business and didn't even know it existed. And that kind of piqued my curiosity because obviously I like watches. So I wanted to chat with him a little bit about the business and what he's doing and when he started it and some of his passions. And obviously I'm going to interject some of my questioning into this conversation and interview with David today. So David, welcome to the Sales Prospector Show.
Thanks. Thanks a lot. It's great to be here.
Thanks for agreeing to the interview and for being part of this show. So tell us about Brooklyn Watches and when you started the business and where you are today and what led you to open up the business and kind of out of New York and Brooklyn of all places.
Sure. I started producing watches for sale at the end of 2009. And I had been selling vintage clocks, antique clocks, at the Brooklyn Flea.
Yeah, one back behind you.
Oh, yeah, that's actually a sign. That's a big display piece.
Okay.
For when I'm at a market. That's sometimes a functioning clock. Today it's 6 o'clock all the time. I don't know. Right. I got to find out what's going on with that. But that's a sign from my company.
Okay.
But I was selling clocks at the flea market, and it was in Brooklyn. It's called the Brooklyn Flea.
Okay.
And that was a fairly new market at that time. People may be aware of it. I don't know. I'm not quite sure how far reaching the knowledge of the Brooklyn Flea is, but it's a interesting upscale kind of market. Artisanal food and crafts and antique things kind of all combined together. And so I was selling clocks, and I could feel that people were really interested in things that said Brooklyn on them, things that were smaller, easier to carry, because in 2009, 2010, we were in the middle of this Great Recession, and the dollar was weak at that moment. So there were lots of people from Europe and Asia coming to New York, wanting to buy things. And I was realizing that there was more interest in watches than there was in vintage clocks or antique clocks. And so I already had knowledge about working with clock mechanisms, but I studied with a watchmaker and started producing wristwatches using vintage pocket watch movements for the mechanisms. So the mechanisms are made in the late 60s and early 1970s. They're mechanical, manual wind, 17 jewel movements. And I seek them out, usually one at a time, set as pocket watches, and restore the movements, modify them a little bit, and set them in new wristwatch cases.
So when you say, Dave, when you say you worked as an apprentice, just for people who don't understand what that means, that you were basically an intern or somebody was mentoring you as you worked by them, maybe at a bench right next to them, kind of teaching you of how to fix a watch. Is that it?
Yeah. Yeah, that's pretty accurate.
Okay, okay. So you worked with him and you started on these pocket watches, right? Which is interesting.
Right.
That a lot of some of the wristwatch guys who started working on wristwatches actually started in pockets because they're bigger. They're
Right.
easier,
I
right?
think a lot of people will recognize that
Right.
when I say 6498, 6497, those are really nice, larger size pocket watch movements that a lot of people start when they're starting to learn about watches. Those are the movements that people start to learn on, and that's what was going on in this class as well.
Where was the class?
Say that again.
Where was the class, David? Where was
it was in Brooklyn. The guy who was teaching it was a watchmaker himself, and he had a company doing very high-end custom watches, and he was hoping to start teaching people how to build watches and then start a company in Brooklyn. And so he sent out a call, and the classes were actually in the Bed-Stuy YMCA.
Oh, wow. Wow. And I think that most people don't realize when it comes to watches that the vast majority of watches that you see today, let's say just in a JCPenney or a Macy's or just big, a big department store, that a lot of these watches are made in massive factories, right? That they're coming off of, for the most part. I'm talking about the broad market watches, the Seikos, the Longines, some of these massive market watches are made in factories using factory manufacturing processes versus a handmade kind of watch, which is what you're actually doing, right, with your Brooklyn watches for the most part?
That's a really interesting question, and I want to be sure that I'm accurate because I want to convey what I'm actually doing.
Sure.
If you were to say that I'm making the watch from scratch, that wouldn't be accurate. Like hand making the movements is not what I'm doing. Right. Yeah. Cutting gears, setting pivots, actually setting stones to make a watch out of a bunch of metal. That's not what I do. There are a couple of guys in the US who are doing that. Their watches are gorgeous. They're in a slightly different price point than
$50,000, $25,000.
I'd say like 25,000, 50,000.
Handmade watches, right?
Yeah, and a watch that's actually made by a person or a group of people, starting with some metal and ending with a mechanism that's functioning and telling time. I hope someday to do work like that. I'd love to do work like that, but I don't have those skills at this point. But what I can do is take a watch that's 40 or 50 years old and restore it, make it go again. That I have the ability to do. And these movements that I'm using were all made by a company called Unitas in Switzerland. That name doesn't exist now. Swatch bought them, and I believe
Swatch bought everything.
Yes, they bought everything. This is in the late 1970s. They were really buying things then, and they bought another company called ETA, ETA, and somehow combined those two. I can't quite tell if ETA bought Unitas and then Swatch bought ETA, or if ETA bought both of those companies. But somehow there are now movements made by ETA that have the same model numbers, 6498 and 6497, that these Unitas movements have. The structure of them is the same. I believe the modern movements beat at a higher rate. The balance wheel is spinning a little bit faster.
So when you're making a watch, one of your brand watches, Brooklyn watches, and you're putting together a Panerai lookalike. I was on your website. There's one that looks a little bit like a Panerai. I don't remember which one it was.
It's probably, did it have a white dial?
I think so, or a black dial.
It could be one or the other of those. The white one is called St. James. I'm naming the watch models after streets or neighborhoods in Brooklyn. And St. James was a street where I was living when I started the company. And the cases are certainly not by a famous manufacturer. They sometimes are an homage to them. They have a feeling of those cases. I love them. That cushion style with the wire lugs. I actually like them not so much because of an association with Panerai, but in the 1920s there were watches that had cases like that, like during and after World War I. There were a lot of sort of square-ish, large wristwatch designs that had wire lugs to hold the straps. I really like those, so I use those sometimes. I wish I were making the cases myself. I have no expertise at smelting, forming, or milling steel, stainless steel, and I would really think it would be great to have a company manufacture cases that I've designed, but usually their minimum orders are about 1,000 pieces. I have made 500 watches in 10 years. So ordering up 1,000 watch cases, that would be like a huge number for my company, because I'm really working at a fairly small, like about one watch per week is what I build.
I got you. So when you're building the watch, the Brooklyn watches, obviously they all say Brooklyn on it, from what I remember.
They say Brooklyn watches on the dial.
On the dial. So you're buying, I guess, gears and movements, ETA movements, I think is what you said, right?
No, Unitas.
You're buying Unitas movements.
Right.
You're putting them. The movement already comes already set, or you're putting everything together. You're just getting the pieces. Oh,
I'm usually buying a complete mechanism that's in a pocket watch case. So it's something that was manufactured in, like I say, around early 70s is when most of these came out. Unitas was making the movements, and it seems to me that they sold them to various companies that wanted to produce a watch for their own, either an in-house brand like a department store or jewelry store. Sometimes I see names of private label watches. So they wanted a watch that said Bailey Banks and Biddle, which I think is a Philadelphia department store or jewelry store. They wanted their own pocket watches. So they would go to Unitas and purchase watches. And I'm not sure if Unitas set them in cases with dials or not, because there's a lot of variety in the casing and in the dials, but the mechanisms are all the same. And the mechanisms are marked with both. They would say Unitas and whoever the company was that purchased the movement. So I'm finding them that way, something where the gears and the plates have been together for 40 years. Sometimes there's a problem and something needs to be replaced. But essentially, I like to keep a mechanism together. It works better that way, because there are slight differences over the production time.
Right.
There are slight differences in things, even till ETA is still making movements now, and some pieces that ETA supplies as replacement parts will fit these vintage movements, others will not.
Interesting, very interesting. So when somebody orders a watch from you, I guess they go to the website, right? brooklynwatches.com?
Yes, brooklynwatches.com.
So they go to brooklynwatches.com and they see a watch there and they click on it, and I don't recall that they have to pay for it up front. Then you in turn begin to put that watch together. Is that what you're doing?
It depends.
Okay.
In a regular season, I try and have at least 12 watches on my website that are ready to buy at any given moment. And that has been true for a year or two, going backward. But the article that you saw in the Wall Street Journal also attracted other people. And at the moment, I've sold almost all the watches that are on my website. I think there are 2 that are shown that are actually available to buy. So I am now I'm putting people's names on a wait list, is how I'm doing it now. There's no money up front. There's only money when the watch is ready to go out. So if you were to go to the website today and saw a model that says available with a price next to it, you can email me and make a purchase over the web. Usually what I do is send out an invoice via PayPal. I find that's a really secure way to have someone pay, rather than them telling me their credit card number over the phone or sending me an email with credit card information in it. I'm not encrypted, so that's not the greatest solution. It's PayPal is taking care of that, so that's the best, I think. So I send an invoice, and the customer pays it, and then I can ship the watch. I'm hoping to get back to that point sometime in the fall, like before the holiday season. I'm hoping to again have watches that are available to buy, because people like that. I like that, to be able to go see something you like and make a purchase. But right now I have enough watches on wait lists that I think it'll be October before I can start building watches to refill my stock.
Right. Okay, I got you.
And we're talking in July. At the beginning of July.
Right, July, August, September, October. You have 3 months.
Right, it's a 3-month wait right now.
Right, yeah, for the most part. Okay, so the watches, the pricing is going from what to what for your watches?
About $950 to $2,000.
Okay.
That's the range that I've got right now. The quality of the mechanism doesn't vary in that price structure. It's about the kind of dial that's on the watch, the face of the watch, the dial that has the numbers on it. If that's a newly made piece by another person, then that's really easy for me. And so those tend to be the less expensive, the $900,000 things. If I'm using a vintage dial, those are rarer. Almost every watch mechanism I buy has a dial in front of it. In a case. Most of them are not that great looking. They're either damaged, or I don't really like the designs. The 70s were a different time than today. And amazingly, I rarely see, I've only seen a couple of designs that really are like the 1970s, like a mod design or modern in style. It's usually people looking back at about 1900. There was a big revival in the late 60s and early 70s of early 20th century things. So it's mostly people making up their idea of what an old-fashioned watch dial looks like. A lot of times that's not so successful. But I can use those dials, I strip them, and put my designs onto those metal plates. So, the watches that are on the less expensive end tend to have newly made dials. The watches with vintage dials on them are a little more expensive, like $1,100, $1,200, $1,300, and that can kind of depend on rarity. There are a few that I've only seen once or twice, so they're harder to find, or things that are really hard to fit that I don't find that many. Those tend to be a little more expensive, and then things that have dials that I've fabricated tend to be a little bit more at the higher end. If you're talking about sapphire crystal versus mineral glass, that'll also make something more expensive. Also, leather straps versus reptile straps, that can change the price somewhat too. The only difference in the mechanism that makes a watch more expensive is sometimes they're skeletonized. So the movement has been cut so that you can see through it. And that even though the quality of the movement is the same,
right,
those movements cost more.
Wow. So can somebody get since you're doing, I want to say you're doing you're putting together your watch by hand, right? You kind of parts together and everything, and kind of, kind of the movements in one shot, and you put in the case and the dial there. And can somebody actually get a watch with their name across if they wanted that?
That's a good question. And so far the answer has been no, but
somebody's asked it before.
Oh yeah, a couple of people have asked. I actually did a very short run of 10 pieces, which is that's a lot of work for me, but for a company that's a small number. It was an edition of 10. We produced 5 of that 10, and it was for a clothing company that was doing a promotion. And those 5 watches have a dial that says their name. Can I say the name of the company?
It's up to you, sure.
Yeah, sure. It was Haspel. Haspel is a clothing company in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, I think, and they invented seersucker, or invented the seersucker suit. Like, they had all this seersucker that was being used for aprons and work clothes, and they kind of created menswear out of that early 20th century, and they wanted to do something celebrating their anniversary. And so there are 5 watches out there that say Brooklyn Watches and Haspel with their logo. It could be possible for someone to do work like that. My problem is not designing a dial that has someone's name on it. The problem is fabricating it, because the way that those names and brands get onto watch dials is fairly complicated, and it involves hand carving a plate called a cliché that receives ink, and then the ink gets picked up on a rubber pad and placed on the dial. That is not work that I'm doing at this moment. There's a dial painter in New York City who does that work for me, because they do a fantastic job. And as you might imagine, the type is really tiny. Right. So if someone I hadn't thought about this, but it would at least double the price of the watch, because you'd have to pay the fabrication costs for that plate, which wouldn't really have any further use after that one time. So I think the answer is no, but I wish the answer were yes.
Yeah, I guess it's all relative. That if somebody wants watches like that made for a particular event and they're willing to pay for the production and the manufacturing of that watch, then so be it.
Right. Yeah. Like it made sense for a company to do that work, because they were producing a set of watches and they really wanted it. They wanted that to happen. But as a person for an ID, to have their name on the dial, I'm probably not the right guy. I am curious about other methods of making dials, either hand engraving, which I don't know how to do, but I can conceive that I could learn how to do hand engraving. Maybe something like that could have some type that's part of it. I don't know anything about 3D printing, but there's the concept of 3D printing watch dials. A lot of people have asked me, could I 3D print watch mechanisms? I don't believe that the technology is really there yet. I'm not an expert at all in computer technologies. I kind of go the other way, right back toward mechanical things. But from what I have seen and from what I've heard from other people, it's not really there yet to make a fine quality mechanical watch movements with 3D printing. But I think you could do a dial with ease. I don't know how to do it. I also teamed with a guy and produced a small number, probably about 10 watches using a laser cutter to make the dial. I still had that brass dial, and I coated it with lacquer, and then a laser beam cut the numbers away from the lacquer, revealing the brass underneath. And those are really lovely. I liked them a lot. And something like that, because it's driven by a computer file, it could have you could do something personal in that way. But there were other technical things that made it challenging, and I haven't gotten back to that yet. And that was at least 5 years ago that I did those. So that's a really long answer to probably not.
That's fine. I appreciate that. Reason why I'm asking is that I came across a watch and clock company for the most part that does mantle clocks and wall clocks. I'm not sure if they have grandfather clocks, but actually the clock company is called Gilbert. And obviously it's my first name. So I found a wall clock that hangs in my house.
Okay.
Well, it's a pendulum clock.
Yeah.
and it's it has you have to wind it with the key.
Right. You're talking about something like 100 years old.
Oh yeah, it's 1905.
Yeah.
Actually.
So yeah, I know that company. They were in Connecticut.
Yes. So
Gilbert. I'm
Gilbert,
trying to think. I know I've worked on clocks from Gilbert. I don't think I own a Gilbert clock right now, but yeah.
Yeah, so that's it's 1905, and it's and it's hanging in my over my fireplace, and it's working, and it keeps relatively good time. It gets a little bit cranky every once in a while, but it needs to be oiled and kind of taken care of, but usually once a year. But that's why I was asking about the name of a watch, a wristwatch. As if you could actually put somebody's name on it. That's where I was going. I have not found a Gilbert watch per se, wristwatch. I've not seen one. Maybe a pocket is out there. Maybe.
Yeah, I would bet you're testing my memory, but I would bet that Gilbert never made wristwatches. They may have made pocket watches, but I don't remember that part.
Yeah, me neither.
There were a couple of watch companies in Connecticut that made, or clock companies in Connecticut that made pocket watches too. New Haven is one.
Yeah.
That they made wristwatches like that. It depends when the companies went in and out of business as to kind of where they fall. And New Haven was producing things long enough that they went into wristwatches, I think in the 30s. But I don't feel like I've ever seen a Gilbert wristwatch, and I don't know that they produced pocket watches either. Seth Thomas was sort of the Cadillac of clocks in Connecticut, and they absolutely produced pocket watches. I don't know if they did wristwatches either. You'd think that they would have, because that name is still around, but the original company went out long after wristwatches were popular. So I don't know. There might be.
Yeah. That's good. I was just curious. When you're I guess trying to educate yourself and kind of what's going on in the market, what are you reading? Are you reading any kind of magazines? Are you a part of an association? Anything that kind of feeds your brain on what's going on?
I'm part of I'm a member of the Horological Society of New York, which is a mid-19th century group of watchmakers. A bunch of German watchmakers in the 1850s formed this group that still exists now. And so they do meetings and lectures once a month, and I can go and hear a wide variety of different kinds of things. It's usually very specific on watches, but sometimes it's broader into other mechanical things. People who do astoundingly specific projects will come and lecture. And so I get a lot of knowledge about things that I know nothing about from those lectures. I tend to kind of look at older watches for ideas. There's a company called Antiquorum. They're a Swiss auction house.
I bought quite a number of pieces from Antiquorum in New York City.
Oh, congratulations!
Thank you.
That's not nothing to buy.
It's not cheap.
To be able to buy something there. Yeah. But they produce beautiful catalogs, and you can really go in and get these inch-thick color books full of pictures of watches and get ideas about what something looked like. If you're lucky enough, you can go into the showroom and see and pick up things that to see what they feel like. So I pay more attention to that than watch magazines, because I feel like I'm always bucking some trend. I'm not quite sure which. At first, because the watches I'm building have pocket watch movements in them, they're bigger than a standard man's wristwatch. I don't even know now what a standard man's wristwatch is. I think at one point it was about 36 millimeters. Something maybe about as big as a quarter or so. Was kind of like what a man's watch was. And the mechanisms that I'm using are 37 across. So the smallest case that I'm using is 41 millimeters across. and then I kind of like 41 to 45. Those are kind of the right size for these movements. By the time you're talking about a 47 millimeter case, there have to be spacers and things inside because the case is actually bigger than the mechanism is. When I started 10 years ago, those watches felt big to people. I remember a lot of people commenting saying, gosh, these, I like them, but they're so big. And now I don't think that a 41 or a 45 millimeter watch seems that big. So to people, like, I don't hear that anymore when I'm getting feedback that, oh, I wish that they were smaller. I don't feel
that's because the rappers years ago started a trend, and the musicians started a trend of wearing these huge watches that were like a brick on their wrist. And they became to integrate itself into culture, and it became to be seen regularly. So a big watch is not necessarily an anomaly anymore. And you're wearing one right now, right? You're wearing, what are you wearing?
I am. This is actually my watch. Here, let me see. I'm new at this whole technology.
That's
talking over a computer.
You want to get closer.
Let's see. What happens if I bring this in? I don't know.
There you go. Good. There you
go. Okay. This is actually my watch.
41, 42?
This is 41 millimeters across, and it's a dial that I've only had 3 other dials in this.
Looks like an IWC a little bit.
Kinda.
Crown. I can't see the crown too well.
Oh, the crown is pretty simple.
Yeah, I see it.
Oh, look. If I tilt it like that, you can kind of see what's going on. But I build a lot of watches like this with a Breguet style font.
Okay.
Because this dial is vintage, so I'm finding Breguet style dials that are very much like this, but early 19th century kind of design.
Right.
But this is a 1960s, like a Helvetica, and I've only found a couple of them.
Very nice.
So at the moment, I can't take orders for this. I have one, and I have one dial available. Unless I decide to sell the watch that I'm wearing, I would take the mechanism and recase it in a new case. But that's the only one right now. I'm trying to find more.
I guess
it was somebody who it must have been a department store or something, that because they've all had the same branding on them.
Right.
When I found them, that only produced a very few, and so that's what I happen to have on today. And I guess that's a pretty good example of what the watches are like. They can get bigger. They don't get any smaller than this one. They kind of have a classic American look. They're fairly simple.
Right.
It's hour and minute hand, and usually a second hand at the 6. Every once in a while, a second hand at the 9.
Yeah.
But no day dates, no moon phases, stuff like that. None of those complications.
So none of your watches have a date on it, have a date at all.
That's correct.
It's just a dial.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm wearing a real simple watch actually today. It's a let me see. Hang on a second. This is actually a Waltham.
Oh.
Waltham 25 jewels, which you don't see very often.
Yeah.
17, right? Or 10. Probably can't see it now. Waltham. The third hand is red, which you don't see very often either. And Waltham Mass, right?
Right. Yeah. Waltham that's a higher grade company. Like I was talking about New Haven. What was the Waterbury? Waterbury kind of somehow or other became Timex over time. Waterbury kind of shifted between one and the other. I'm not quite sure, but those are kind of what I would call dollar watches. That's not always accurate, but there was a moment when the pocket watches cost $1. But Waltham was a much higher quality company at the beginning, and certainly that one as well. Like that looks like it's from the 60s or 70s.
That's exactly right. 65. 1965, and still running and still keeping good time. And what are we like now? It's like 40, almost 50 years. Yeah. 50 years old, give or take, and it's still running. And again, this is really it's a higher end Waltham, but it's a lower end from a cost perspective. You can get these vintage watches if they're running $75, $150, $80, $100. I mean, it's not.
Yeah.
They're within most people's range where they can buy it.
Sure.
Almost like a watch when you would go into a department store and buy a $85 watch. I mean, it's these vintage watches you can buy for about the same price, have a lot more history to it. Some of the things that I read is
oh yeah, I have that.
Yeah, okay. That's the complete guide to watches, price guide to watches, comes out every year. Their prices sometimes I'm like, I wonder if they're up to date, quite frankly. But
do you think that the prices are higher or lower in the marketplace than in the book?
I think that they tend to be higher in the marketplace than what's in here. So I tend to probably add maybe 5%, a little bit on top of a price of a watch. And then the way I kind of price it, if somebody obviously is watching and saying, what's my watch worth? Or they're listening to the podcast, I look on eBay, right? Which is obviously pulling in a lot of data. Some of my watch collecting purist friends don't like going to eBay because they say it diminishes the value of the watch. They call it Flea, because it drives down the pricing. But it's the platform that's out there with the most data. And you go into eBay and you search by your watch. You click on sold, right? Items, completed sold item. And you see that the watches went for, what you have on your wrist, went for about $300. So take that, compare it to an up-to-date book like this one for the year, and it gives you a sense. And if you're off 5%, you kind of know what the market. Now, granted, somebody may buy the watch and pay you $500 for it because that's what they want. Yeah. They've been looking for the watch, and it'll throw everything out of whack. So I use that, and I look at old books too, like this one here. Oh yeah. It goes back years. The Vintage American and European Watch, Book 5. But it's an old book, but again, it just gives me, to try to find the actual watch itself. Sometimes you can't find the vintage watch exactly like this Waltham I have. I can't find it. I get an old book like this. It's in here.
Oh, okay.
And I come up with a pricing mechanism based on how old it is.
Right.
And what maybe eBay sold something similar to, and I come up with something. That's there's no here's another one. Another book that I have. This one's pretty good.
That has a swatch on the cover.
Yeah, it does. Yep. And it's wristwatches by Isabella de Lisley Selby. See that there? Yeah. So another book. So I just try to get some books just to get some pricing and ideas, and what is something worth. For the wristwatches. Given I'm in the industry, and obviously you're in the industry. When it comes to, I guess, watch brands, I mean, I know you wear your own watch, right? Obviously.
That's true. I find it's in my best interest to always have one of my watches on.
Yeah, duh.
Because I love watches, and I have some other ones, but I find that if I'm not wearing mine, someone invariably will ask me, "Oh, well, what do you have on?" And if it isn't one of mine, then they're wondering why I'm not wearing my own watches. So I tend to not wear other things anymore.
But when you were wearing them, what were you wearing?
They were, in the world of watch collecting, they were stylish but very kind of lower end, like Elgin. I have a beautiful Lord Elgin tank watch I think it's from 1939 because it's engraved. It was a presentation watch to somebody. And when I worked as an apprentice clockmaker when I was 20 years old, that watch came in scrap. Like it came in a lot of things that somebody was selling, and I received it as a gift from the owner of the store. So that's the watch that I always think of. I've owned it since I was 20 years old, and it's the watch I would put on today if I were not going to wear one of my own. But I've had other things, a couple of Tiffany watches, again, kind of older, not as high end. I have never been able to move in the Patek Rolex world, which is not really fair to say. I guess I'm talking about new watches made by those companies, because there are beautiful things by Rolex and Patek and other people that you see for sale, and they're not more expensive than the watches that I sell. Like, you can buy a Rolex for less than $1,000 from the 50s in a small size, not a big Submariner that is what somebody wants, or Omega, those really stylish, popular designs. But if you're looking for more of a dressy watch from before Rolex was so sporty, like sport oriented, those watches are beautiful and affordable, I think.
The watches that are kind of migrating into what people tend to associate with high-end watches are the Rolexes, for the most part, that have a very distinctive look. People look at it, that's a Rolex, or it could be a Tudor, T-U-R, which is very similar to the Rolex. And some of the Invictas, even also Invicta watches, also depending on which one you get, look similar to a Rolex until you come up on it and realize it's not. So the brand name that people associated with high-end luxury watches is the Rolex, which a lot of sales reps, right, who have kind of made it and got a big check at one point, bought themselves a Rolex, and the Datejust watches is kind of like where the entry level point is for the Rolex, and there you can get a 1960, 70 watch at about 1,000, 1,200, 13. If you can get a good deal for $9, if you're really lucky, you can buy one. But you're in that range, almost where you are with your watches, right? But 900, 1,000, 12, 13. You can get a used Rolex Datejust, nothing fancy, but nice. And it's Rolex. And a lot of the sales reps that run around and doing sales in the field of wearing Rolexes, it's a sign of status. Pateks as well. Audemars Piguet, they're using those AP watches, and that's an example, again, status. I still have a 1953 Rolex Datejust, mint condition, that I bought with my first check as a sales rep. That I got with a big bonus check at auction. And it's mint condition. I still have it. It's a sentimental piece, which I won't sell, right? Because I bought it when I got my first big check as a sales rep before I started my company. So it has a lot of value there. There is an association between watches and people who collect watches and other things that people do for hobbies. Like there's a connection between watches and cars, watches and fine dining, watches and cigars, right? So that we were talking before about watches, offline, about watches and cars, right? There's a bleed over right there.
There is, and I think that it seems to be in the air right now. I was reading about an event that's happening in the fall in Detroit. Apparently, Henry Ford saw the Waltham watch factory, I guess in the 1890s or very early 1900s. And because in the story that I heard, he's already interested in cars, but he's building cars by hand. And he sees this factory making watches with interchangeable parts, which is something that was going on in Connecticut with watches or clocks for a long time. I mean, interchangeable parts in Connecticut clocks is like 1830, I think. Eli Terry, is that right? Yeah, I think that's right. So it wasn't that idea wasn't brand new in timekeeping, but it was a big new idea for car manufacturing. And so there's a big symposium in Detroit to talk about the link between watches and clocks and automobiles. And it goes beyond this inspirational story of Henry Ford to today, where people who collect cars may also collect watches. I mean, I see them as related to each other, mechanical things, more unusual things, something that not everybody has, classic designs from other periods. So there's all kinds of stuff. I know that, well, it's interesting because the cars that are really popular now are like muscle cars, things from the 60s, things from the 70s. And I think watches from that period are popular too. and furniture is popular. Interior design is popular from that period right now as well. I have a antique car. It's a little older. It's not really a muscle car,
Right.
but it's a Ford from 1940. So it's a
which you still drive.
Yeah, I drive it. And since we first spoke, the linkage in the throttle lever that snapped. So, and I use the throttle a lot in case people listening in. Modern cars don't really have a throttle anymore, but these older cars have a lever on the dashboard that you can pull, and it acts like the gas pedal. So you can actually rev the engine with a lever on the dashboard as well as with a pedal on the floor. And I use that because my car, it doesn't like to go from second or third gear to a stop going down a hill.
Right.
So if you're coming to a stop sign and going downhill, you need to just step on the gas a little bit or it'll stall. It's something with the carburetor. And so if you're already stepping on the clutch and the brake, it's really handy to reach over and pull this knob.
And pull the throttle, right.
To just rev the engine. I just have to do it one time, and then it's great. And then I can shift into first gear and go forward again. So that snapped, but I can still drive the car. And
Wow.
I was on the phone talking to somebody this morning, getting this little link. It's like this little rubber piece that hooks the two levers together to make this thing go. But I really love the car. I'm learning more about it. When I was a kid, my father repaired the cars that he drove and that my mom drove.
Right.
So it's almost old enough. Like, those cars were made in the 60s that I remember him working on. But I was a little kid at the time, so I unfortunately didn't learn everything about fixing cars. But they're ultimately repairable. So it's, again, similar to kind of a classic watch. You may not be able to repair it yourself, but someone can repair it. It isn't ruined when it stops working. Yeah,
that's interesting. That again, those who like cars, the mechanical piece, obviously old cars and watches, there's that mechanical kind of operation, and then there's an association there. Although many may not make the association, there is an association.
Yeah.
And there's also some of the people who like to find cars. Many are perfectionists. Now getting into the psychology of it. Okay, some of them are very detail oriented. Perfectionist, and they like the watch to run right, be clean looking. They like the car running flawlessly, being clean. There's a certain psychology and personality around the people who like mechanical vintage kind of watches versus the regular Joe who buys Rolex because it looks good and they put on his wrist and it's nice, but he may not necessarily, he or she may not necessarily be that kind of person. But someone who likes the old vintage stuff tends to have a certain psychology associated with it, and that's probably, I'm assuming you're probably along that line to some extent.
Maybe, possibly not all the way. I know exactly who you're talking about, but with watches more so. I'm more of a perfectionist. Like especially when I'm sending something out, it's not quite right. Oh my gosh, it can't go out yet.
Right.
Really wanting something to run as well as it possibly can before it goes out to a client. That's very important to me. But it's interesting. This is the first time I've owned this car for about 3 years, and it's the first time that I've had a car like this. And it's kind of helpful to me to be able to drive it, like to be able to get in it and drive it and park it and walk away from it on the street. Not in Brooklyn. I'm talking about upstate. I move back and forth between Brooklyn, New York, and a town in Columbia County, which is about 2 hours north of New York City. And so owning a classic or an antique car in Manhattan is a very different experience than owning one somewhere else. And so it's about garaging and parking and driving, and I think a certain kind of person probably thinks it's fun to drive in New York City. I actually don't mind driving in New York City, but it's not a place to, well, it's sort of the same thing that I'm saying. It's not a place to drive calmly when you're worried what's going to happen to the outside of your car. You know, if somebody bangs it or bumps it or you nick something somewhere, that's going to happen in the city. So up here,
Right.
in the country, it's a more relaxed kind of thing. But the car that I've got is in original condition. It hasn't ever been restored, and the paint's in pretty good shape, but it's almost 80-year-old paint and 80-year-old upholstery and stuff like that. And that's a different kind of a feeling. Like, I'm really worried about making a change that will make it less original.
Okay.
But it's kind of, it's a little more comfortable that I don't have to worry about it every moment, as far as it being perfect, because it's far from perfect. Although that seems to be a trend now too in these old cars, to find something that was never touched. It looks like it just came out of 50 years in a barn somewhere. People are not restoring cars the way they did in the 80s. Where everything was taken apart and absolutely scrubbed and replated and repainted and reupholstered and looks like it was when it was brand new. That seems to not be as popular.
Off the frame restoration.
Yeah, I mean, I think people really want stuff to run well. You don't really want to be driving around going, "Oh gosh, I hope it starts again." when I come out of the restaurant, I hope it starts. But
push it downhill and takes a choke.
Yeah, but on the other hand, it seems to be a movement away from that heavily restored to more original appearing. I think that's true with watches too. I know that some people want a 50-year-old Rolex to look perfect, polished, refinished dial, the glow, the radiation, or not radium, but
iridium.
The glow in the dark.
Yeah.
Component. They want all that to be fresh and new and perfect, but some people don't want a watch that's touched like that. They really want it to show its age and look like it's 50 years old. So it depends. I think it depends on who the person is, like who the collector is. I was in the case of the car, I was lucky to find a car that I could afford that was really in great shape that way. So I didn't feel like it needed to be restored. It needed some mechanical things done to it, but it didn't need a frame off restoration to be able to drive it around.
Okay. Well, we're gonna rapid fire questions now.
Okay.
And this is more personal stuff. Has nothing to do with, and there's no rhyme or reason. Coffee or tea?
Tea.
Hot or cold?
Hot or cold tea?
Yeah, hot or cold tea.
Both. More hot, I guess.
Hot dogs, ketchup or mustard?
Ketchup.
Okay. Burgers, ketchup or mustard?
Ketchup.
Okay. Bagels, toasted or not toasted?
Toasted.
Okay. Dirty water dog on the street, would you buy one?
No.
Okay.
No.
Shish kebab at a cart in Manhattan, would you buy one?
No.
Okay. It's called flesh on a stick. No.
Yeah. I think the only thing I've ever really bought on the street in New York is pretzels.
Okay. Because they're safe.
Because they're safe. Yeah, I'm afraid. My mother was a nurse, and so there was no thought ever. And she lived in New York for quite a while. Not when I was around, but
right.
After World War II, she lived in New York City for about 10 years. So there was no chance of buying food from a cart on the street at all, and I think I've kind of continued with that. Anyway, I'm sorry, I'm giving a very long answer to your rapid fire.
Okay. Movies, fiction, nonfiction, drama, sci-fi, horror?
Yes. I think all those, probably more fiction than nonfiction. I like documentaries, okay, but most of the movies I watch are stories.
I got stories, okay. Vacation spot, if you can go anywhere right now, where would you be?
Wow. Well, where I'd really like to go that I've never been is Egypt, although it's been in the upper 90s here for about a week. So I can't imagine going today to Egypt, but maybe in the fall or winter.
So you prefer hot or cold weather?
I'm going to say cold right now. I prefer fall.
Okay.
But I'd say fall. But it's been really rough up here. Probably not for you.
No.
Like 95 or 97 might not sound so hot to you, but
no, it is hot down here too. For those who are listening, I'm in the Carolinas today, North Carolina to be specific. And you're in Brooklyn today, or you're upstate New York?
No, I'm upstate today.
Upstate New York. Okay, gotcha. Yeah. Well, that wraps it up. I want to thank you for sharing some of your time with us today and sharing about Brooklyn watches. For those who are watching on video on YouTube or going to be listening to the podcast, in the show notes there'll be a link to brooklynwatches.com, and I'll have David's name there as well. If for some reason you want to reach out and potentially put an order in, there is a 3-month wait, potentially maybe longer.
Maybe longer.
for a watch that he would put together for you, handmade in the sense of putting it together for you. And I love talking about watches, and thank you so much for sharing some of your time with us today.
Sure, thank you.
You're welcome. Catch up soon, buddy.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.